thank you for finding During the Break podcast. Until we can get back into our studio consistently, we are taking the audio from our Facebook Live videos and converting them to podcasts. Great conversations, great stories, great tips, and great people. I have other podcasts as well. One's about business and leadership. You can find that at marketingmixradio.com. I have one about adventures in the great outdoors with people who are living it every day. Dayfirepodcast.com as well. Now, this podcast is sponsored locally by a good buddy of mine, Granite Garage Floors of Chattanooga. If your garage floor needs a makeover, call Dan Meninger for a free quote, 423-592-3131 or granitegaragefloors.com, Chattanooga. It's /Chattanooga. The lifetime warranty. I have known Dan for over 20 years. Trust me, there's no one I would trust with a job like this in my house. There's no one that's going to do you a better job. Garage floor, concrete porch, showroom. If it needs a makeover, call Dan Meninger at Granite Garage Floors of Chattanooga. Now, let's get to it. Enjoy During the Break podcast. The Revolt of the Public, and it's by Martin Gurri. And we'll talk a little bit about it. Let me go ahead and set this up just so you can understand. The first part of this, we're going to talk about the information tsunami, what that looks like, put it into some perspective. Then we're going to talk about the effects of that's had on authority in the world, the United States, how it's kind of undermined it. Then we're also going to talk about what he predicted could happen, what might happen, and some possible solutions. And I can promise you that there are going to be some things that Eric and I disagree on or maybe give each other some pushback. And I'm going to try to pull up a slide or a graph during this, and we'll see how it goes. So with all of that being said, my name is Clint Powell. I host During the Break podcast of, by, and for the people podcast. And I also do some sales and marketing consulting and stuff like that. But let me bring up the co-host, Eric Buchanan himself, along with John Ballinger, helped start these conversations almost a year ago. What's up, Eric Buchanan?
Hey, Clint, how are you?
I'm good. You shut me down 3 times before we came on air because we were saying all the good stuff before we went live.
As usual, the name of your other show During the Break is a big hazard. You were starting to say exciting stuff, and I'm like, whoa. Hold that thought, Clint, because you say it now, it won't be as good when you say it live. We had a great little discussion in the 5 minutes before we went on the air, and we're going to try to cover a whole lot more. So, hi, everybody. I'm Eric Buchanan. I'm a disability insurance attorney here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm also a Navy veteran. I studied history as my major in college. I went to law school at Washington and Lee, and I love studying the U.S. Constitution, American history, and politics. I've read a lot about the Constitution and a lot about history, and I've tried to read a lot about current events and love talking about all this stuff. I'm also the Tennessee co-coordinator for Braver Angels, an organization that is focused on patriotic empathy, restoring civil discourse in America. And the basic idea is to get back to the point where people who disagree politically can still talk to each other, remember that we're all Americans, and work on the skills to allow us to do that better. And then eventually take those lessons that we learn through Braver Angels and try to help the better society, the bigger society, restore ourselves to an America where we don't have to agree politically, but we don't have to be shouting at each other and bashing each other over the heads. And I think these conversations are similar. Admittedly, I'm a libertarian conservative, and I come out from that perspective. But these books have opened my eyes to some stuff, and what we've been talking about have opened my eyes, and try to look at it from a bigger picture and think about how people from both sides would look at it.
Well, and I don't want you to get disappointed because I know you do sometimes in the amount of people that join us live because there's people that got dinner and ball games. But I want to give you some something to hang your hat on. After all of these videos, when they go out to iTunes or podcasts, and you can find most of them still currently under During the Break umbrella, even though we are pulling them off one by one and downloading them to our Of, By, and For the People podcast. The viewership, listenership goes up so much over 2-3 weeks following because people tune in at their convenience. That's why I like podcasting, because if you miss it at 11, you don't miss it. If you miss it at 6, you don't miss it. Now, they might miss the ability to join in, or, they may not appreciate our live banter in real time, but they don't miss it. Now, I say all that to say this. All right. We have had all of these conversations about the big cycles, and I've got 4 pages of notes of just random thoughts thrown in front of me. You wanted to start with, let's put the the tsunami of information in perspective. Now, before we do that though, let's talk specifically why you like this book. And let's both of us tonight, and it's difficult. I like a political debate. We're going to try to keep our responses to 2 to 3 minutes each, so we both don't go on tangents and rants. Why did you like this book specifically of the books you had an option to read? Why did you like this one?
Well, first of all, I thought it was pretty authentic and authoritative. The guy who wrote it was a former CIA analyst. We'll get into some more details. We actually talk about the book. The explanation of why are we so polarized? Why are we suddenly seeing so much distrust in government? I will cut it to its essence. His hypothesis is that there is so much information available on the internet, on social media, that it is, and we'll talk about it in more detail in a minute, many times the amount of information all of mankind has gathered in its history has been available in the last 20 years, and it's been multiplying, it's been doubling. And that information has resulted in a world where anybody who had a position of authority or an institution of authority has got to be scrupulously honest, or else they're going to lose their parent authority. They're going to lose the ability to speak with any authority. We no longer live in a world where old institutions, just because they've always been respected, continue to be respected. Famous newspapers, famous TV stations, members of the government. And a big part of it is because if they say anything that's not true, there's a massive amount of information available that the public finds out about immediately and knows that they're not telling the truth. So that's one big problem. And the second big problem is that leaders haven't figured this out yet. So we still have people that are engaged in the old school, I will tell you and you will just shut up and believe me method of leadership. And that's not working anymore. And so as a society, we are breaking down a lot of the trust we have in our old institutions. And we'll talk about this a whole lot of why this is important.
We will, and we're going to pull up a chart in a minute, and I'll let you tell me when you pull the chart up. But I'm going to say this, though. I did not hear, and I might have missed it because I listened to it on Audible. I did not hear him give an example of an institution or a leader, whether it's in government or anything. I did not see an example that would live up to the scrutiny of today. So, and one of the reasons I'm a little more cynical now than I was before I read the book is I can't see something and point to it and go, see, that's what made it through this tumultuous, this tsunami of information. So we're going to get to that. I know I'm not jumping ahead, but I don't see the touchstone to look at. And so that's why I think as we go through this, you might get some questions from me of like, yeah, but.
Well, let's talk about that very quickly, and I'd like to get to the specific information to get people kind of understanding the playing field that we're working in and how much. When we say a tsunami of information, why does the author describe that?
Yeah.
But I will cut to the chase and say this. When's the last time you heard a significant leader stand up and say it was my responsibility, it was my fault, I am the person responsible, the buck stops here? We can name that in the last century. Harry Truman had a sign on his desk, the buck stops here. And one of my favorite anecdotes, and he does include this in the book, is after the Bay of Pigs invasion failed in Cuba in the early 1960s, the United States, for political reasons, basically had to deny that they were involved. Otherwise, we were egging on a war with the Soviet Union. But when that invasion failed, the attempted revolution against Fidel Castro that we were behind, John F. Kennedy went on national TV and said, to the extent the Americans were responsible for anything, the Americans were involved in this, I was the responsible officer. It was my fault.
But that wasn't that's not the whole story of that though. But go ahead.
No, it's not. So let's get to let's establish the foundation here because people want to know what this book is about.
Do you want me to pull that slide?
Not yet.
Now?
Hang on a second.
Okay.
All right. So one of the things he talks about in this book, first of all, understand this. He was a former CIA analyst, and part of his job was looking at the way social media, regular media, and other information was affecting the geopolitics of the world. What was going on around the world that would be a threat to the United States caused by things having to do with mass media, etc. And the idea that a lot of information was becoming available was something that hadn't been studied yet. So he and some of his peers started trying to do an analysis of how much information was available. He's pointing out that we're coming from a world in the late 20th century, and this is a consistent theme throughout this book, that the old way of passing out information in the 1900s was for TV or radio or newspapers to cover that information. But to get a massive view of that information, it was really hard to do unless you went to the public library and read a lot of different newspapers, or maybe the New York Times, which was basically the paper record for a lot of the 20th century. You could go read that and get a lot of information, but you had to find the New York Times, and you had to wait till a copy got to your city and that kind of thing. And what happened then later when we had TV? Well, Walter Cronkite and the other anchors at 6 o'clock in the evening, we had 3, maybe 4 channels if you counted PBS. So the whole world, or the whole United States at least, basically got 30 minutes of news, and it was essentially the same stories. And all of the other information about what was going on in the world, the elites chose for us what we got to hear and see. And that started changing in the 1990s. So what happened really in the 1980s was CNN was the first news network. And cable TV and satellite TV became the first small wave of this massive information. And one great example he gives is how it affected the Middle East. In the 1980s and early 1990s, if you were an Egyptian living in Cairo, you had 2 TV stations, and they were both owned by the state government, by the government of Egypt, by the dictator. By the 1990s, if you got a satellite, you could have 400 channels, including Showtime and ESPN and all of those channels that brought in the Western Hollywood level of information, plus CNN, plus eventually Al Jazeera, which came along in 1996, which gave a lot of news about the Middle East. So there was this wave of information that came from all these massive TV stations. And the next wave of information, also started in the 90s, was the addition of these things on the internet. The first server of the World Wide Web, did you know this was, you do because you read the book, maybe you don't remember. The first server was turned on in 1990. That's the first server in the World Wide Web. MP3s, so you could download podcasts and songs, came along in 1993. The first blog was in 1997, but Blogger, the first free software to do a blog, that was in 1999. That wasn't all that long ago. That was only 22 years ago. Wikipedia was launched in 2001. Wikipedia is only 20 years old. Friendster 2002, MySpace 2003, and then the big one, the Mac Daddy, comes along, Facebook, in 2004. So it's only 17 years old. Apple iTunes has been around since 2003. So early 2000s, those things were happening. So he went back and did this review. And now you can bring up the chart and we'll talk about.
Yep. I'm going to leave the screen. So hold on.
Yep.
There you go.
There is so much information available in the world. And for those of you, yep, this is awesome. It's a little hard to read on the screen. This is a chart from the book. But if you look at the words at the top, 57 billion gigabytes, and at the end of those, when you look down that line, it says 1999. All of the information that existed in human history in 1999 could be measured in about 2.5 billion gigabytes. That's the Library of Alexandria. That's the Library of Congress. That's every library in London and every other city in Paris, in Europe and Africa and North and South America, everywhere. And what was already on the internet, with the World Wide Web being 10 years old. In the year 2000, there were 3 billion gigabytes of information available on the web. Now look at that chart. That's when that starts to turn in a dramatic upward incline, so that by 2001, the entire internet had doubled its information, which means it doubled in between 2000 and 2001 the total amount of information available to mankind throughout its history, doubled in 1 year, and that was 20 years ago. In 2002, it doubled again. In 2003, it doubled again. And now we are 18 years later. And Clint, you can go ahead and come back in. The point is, there is so much information available that anybody that wants to look anything up can fact check just about anything. And it may be true, it may not be true. They have to double and triple check, and you have to figure out which sites you're going to rely on. But if you have a politician stand up and say X is true, hundreds of thousands to millions of people can immediately go look online and go, Well, that's not what so-and-so says, or that's not what somebody else says, or that's not what he said last week. And that's
Or
one of the big ones. When they show you can go to find a video of, well, I've always been in favor of immigration. And then they pull up a video, and 3 years ago, the same politician was, we need to build a bigger wall. And those examples are rampant. And
well,
that's part of this concern.
well, and two, the and then we'll kind of a nice segue into the how this is affecting leaders and organizations. But you kind of nailed it. Even if it's just a lie or an omission, we can actually now, though, when we see mass media or we see anybody now using certain words in headlines, we can go actually see or hear the comment in context. So we can go judge for ourselves what he meant or she meant in the context of what they were saying. And so when Eric spins it as Clint said he didn't want kids to be educated, and then they go watch it and Clint said something that's totally different in the context of what he said big picture, everybody goes, Eric's full of crap.
Let's use a specific example. I think Trump was full of crap with a lot of stuff he said. There's some stuff that I like about Trump and his policies, but one of the constant debates about Trump was that he was a liar and he was stupid, all that all the time. Well, one of the stories that came up during the middle of the pandemic was, I can't remember which department it was that came up with a study of whether the coronavirus could survive on surfaces and whether it could survive in the air. And it really should have been important national news that we were starting to learn more, that it was very unlikely you were going to get sick from touching something, and that it was extremely easy to clean up with ordinary bleaches. Trump asked a stupid question. This was high school level. Everybody in biology class turns and looks at the dumbest kid in the class and goes, what the hell are you talking about? Because his idea was, he said, well, is there any way to use it to actually treat people if you like run their blood through a machine that exposes it to the Clorox
to
or whatever?
Bleach, yeah,
like to bleach. And the guy from the agency was like, no, sir, we haven't done that yet. Well, within freaking minutes, media sources opposed to Trump, changed it to him saying you should inject yourself with Clorox to get rid of your COVID, and that Trump wants to kill people because he's telling them to inject themselves. So what we had was the classic situation of Trump saying something pretty dumb, but instead of the American people being able to sit around, scratch our heads and go, do we really want to support somebody who thinks that maybe it's an idea to treat yourself or not, or that we should be exploring treatments by using some kind of a Clorox if you put it through a machine, and maybe a blood machine or something? Pretty dumb idea. But then the whole media that's opposed to Trump made themselves out to be liars and exaggerators when they said Trump should inject himself. But you'll find people today that are absolutely sure that one reason Trump was such a crazy person that didn't deserve to be president is because he said you should inject yourself with Clorox. That's not what he said. But it's a great example of how you can't run something by the American people. People actually went back and watched what he said, knew the media was lying. But at the same time, people on the other side think Trump is full of crap.
That's my point is, yes, we can find people that he gets discredited by, or the media gets discredited by, because we know and we see it. But then there's this whole other group of people that refuse to see it. And I wrote this down. I kind of smiled when you were saying what Trump asked, because I saw the full clip. And later on, I think they came out where they said you could try to run people's blood through stuff. And
but it was actually something that was being considered for an experiment.
It's silly, but here's my funny part of it. Here's what I smiled for. Asking questions that seem silly is part of science. I mean, he's not a scientist. I'm just telling you, I know people in the scientific world. I know engineers. I know very, very smart people. You're an attorney. Before somebody comes in and says, hey, here's my problem, I know before you tell them the solution, you got a litany of questions you're going to ask them. Some may seem silly, but the being curious part of it just got dismissed. And the fact that they looked at it when he's stupid, I went, he's asking questions. You can't say we've not been through this before and then say questions, but I understand your point. There I go.
Let's keep for a second to the point of the book that we're trying to do a review on, because I think this is crucial. One of, I think, the concerns I have with this book and why I think it needs to be followed up with other reading is that his premise is simply based on the fact that we're in a world of hurt, and all these interesting things we're going to talk about from the book that are affecting our society, our culture, causing the polarization, causing the fractures. he's just as simply pointing out that with the amount of information that's available, that the lies are going to be exposed, that you can't, as an institution or a politician, just say something and expect everybody to believe it because your lies are being exposed. He doesn't really touch on the volume of misinformation that's out there or that might be manufactured. He's describing these problems are going to be bad enough just because the truth is fully exposed and people are part of the network of exposing that information. And
Yeah.
Clint, before we forget, do you want to put up a link to the book itself so
Oh,
that
yeah. Go
so
ahead.
that people have that in the notes? So
Well, go
let's
ahead.
finish the setup real quick just to get some basic understanding here. So one of the things he talks about as an example of how this has affected stuff is the death of the daily newspaper. It's extremely hard anymore for most cities to support a written paper. Some still do. Chattanooga has one where we live. You can still buy the New York Times and print the Wall Street Journal. But for the most part, people get their news from electronic sources, which also means they can go directly to the type of articles they care about. So if you just want to read about sports, you can go online and read 5 or 6 different papers version of yesterday's baseball games. You don't have to buy the full paper to get the crossword puzzle and the comics and everything else that comes in there. And so people have fractured their sources of information. And then another point that he makes is that people have become their own producers and sharers of information through social media. Hey, look, I can show you how Trump was lying. Let me post this up to show the other side of what he actually said. And before you know it, everybody knows that he's lying. And then the last thing I want to kind of talk about is some big picture. Here's how he describes it. The new information age can be described as a slow motion collision between two modes of organizing life. One was the traditional 20th century hierarchical industrial and top-down system. Think about old school television. You watch TV, it speaks, you listen. You think of the old-fashioned factory jobs from the 20th century. Here's what you do that job. The other system that we have now entered is the networked, egalitarian, and bottom-up system. And what we're watching with, sometimes it's Trump, sometimes it's Biden. Pick out your favorite politician. When Trump says something like COVID's going to go away, it's just going to be a miracle. Well, you know what? I read some stuff about the pandemic of the 1918, 1919 Spanish flu, and it kind of did go away that way, as a matter of fact. But Trump can't just predict that. So, of course, everybody says, well, he's full of crap. But then you have, Biden, the great example we keep repeating is, there's no crisis at the border, and it's not us keeping kids in cages. That was Trump. And within 10 minutes, a Democratic congressman posts pictures of kids currently in cages. So that just it just exposes everything. The last thing that I think we need for foundational understanding is he's trying to find the name for this new age. And he says the 5 big events in human history that affected a revolutionary change in the way people communicate was, first, the ability to write at all. Hieroglyphics and symbols. Second, it was the development of an alphabet, which allowed us to communicate complex ideas by paper. And that allowed the civilizations of the Greeks and the Romans, the Phoenicians. Then there was the printing press, which entered in the whole modern era of the Reformation and the age of reason and the age of common education, where more people could read than ever had been true in history. And then he said, then there was the age of mass media. First the radio, maybe papers, newspapers, then radio, and then TV. All of it, though, was we talk, you listen, unless you want to pay the money to run a commercial or something. And then, starting around the year 2000, he calls it today's networked and diffuse bottom-up information age, or simply the fifth wave.
Yeah. He referred to the fifth wave quite a bit, and once he set that term in place, he used that throughout the book to refer to this time on the differences and what's moving forward. And I told you this today. I'm going to trust you to pull me back into the relevant moments of this book for you, because I got stuck in a few places where it seems so obvious to me. Because if I'm not mistaken, George Friedman was a geopolitical analyst. This gentleman was a CIA guy and a geopolitical guy. They see what's happened in other countries. And like you, they love history. So they put those two things together and say, hey, everybody, this is what's going to happen if we don't watch it. And it frustrates me that we cannot seem to find people with common sense in their eyeballs to go, hey, we should not be doing some of these things. I got stuck in chapter 7 a little bit. And unfortunately, when I wrote my notes down, I actually wrote in a way I can't understand too much of it, but it's okay. But I don't want to skip forward to chapter 7 until we set up the book as far as the onslaught of information and how it is affecting and undermining the authority. And you nailed it. And here's the other thing. You combine what we've talked about with the storm before the calm in this book, and you have leaders that are using things that are no longer effective. And the reason we know that now is because think how these two books intertwine. We can see they're not effective now, right? We can look back because of all the information. I can go Google or YouTube. I can see what the cycles look like from a historical perspective. And then I can put two and two together going, oh, well, now that I've heard these books or read these books, I can completely see that they're going to try to dump money just like they did in the 70s, and it's not going to work. And that's where the rubber meets the road on why these kind of conversations are important.
And why are you and I, two dumb rugby players from Chattanooga, Tennessee, sitting around talking about this stuff, but it looks like the people in DC haven't begun to even have conversations about how do we deal with the new fifth wave of information and all the other stuff going on. For anybody who's curious, Clint said he got tied up in chapter 7. I don't want to give all the chapters away, but chapter 6 is called The Crisis of Authority. And that's basically what we're talking about. He establishes a pretty solid case for the idea that not just people, but institutions are losing their apparent authority. They're just not trusted anymore. People just don't trust automatically the federal government, the CDC, the FAA, the IRS, that we're here to help, the government's on your side, whatever it is, plus the politicians themselves, because there's so much information that shows that they're lying when they are, or maybe there's misinformation that accuses them of lying when they're not. But anyway, there's a massive loss of trust. So that's the crisis of authority. And then the following of that is the failure of government, which I think is an important part of his conversation. And I can sum up the key thing to me that I learned from the failure of government is this: that in the 20th century, big democracies made big promises to solve big problems. The big democracies that promised to solve those big problems forgot one of the most fundamental rules of solving a big problem, that big problem exists in a much bigger, more complex system. And you can't fix that problem without affecting a lot of other stuff. And often the effects of all the other stuff makes it so the problem is unfixable. Or if we do fix it, we've done it in such a way that we basically created a totalitarian country, which has all kinds of other problems. So fixing an individual problem within a system is often not going to work. And here's the real problem. The government and politicians in these big democracies have been promising that they would fix those problems now for really kind of 100 years, going back to around World War I, and they haven't fixed those problems.
Well, and let's be specific what we're talking about, because, and whether you call them big problems or sins of the heart, we're going to fix poverty. We're going to fix racism. We're going to fix equality. And I'm not telling you we can't make strides, we can't do better, but government is not built to fix it. And here's why. Nothing in a broken world, which we are, coming from a spiritual perspective, nothing will fix those things. You can only try to do a little better. But when you start making promises that you can't keep, and I think it was chapter 7, and I don't think that the audio version, I don't think the chapters were numbered differently. So chapter 7 is when he talks about Spain and Israel and all of the uprisings of 2011 and 2013. And the reason I love this book, this part especially, go read it or listen to it, because what he does is he goes through how the wave of these revolutions or these insurgencies started, their foundational places online, how they manifested, how they peaked, and then how they died off a little bit. But whether it's in Spain or whether it's in Israel or whether it's in the United States, they all look the same, basically, the organizational, the structure, and they had some common things in some things in common. And it's basically, The guy I was listening to had a pretty good tone in his voice, but you have these unsatisfied group of people complaining about a system while they're about, especially with capitalism. They were talking about capitalism and leadership, using the very products that were provided to them through capitalism and leadership. In other words, I'm going to complain about capitalism on my iPhone. I'm going to complain about capitalism on my day off. And it was just weird. It was a great chapter, I thought. That was a great chapter.
There's a lot of details about that. What's interesting is a lot of times in Europe and the Middle East, it was the middle class, younger people who had a job, who came from a family with money, who could afford a cell phone. They're wearing or a smartphone. They're wearing Nikes. Maybe even they're wearing blue jeans from the United States, and they are wearing a backpack from Merrill. But they're screaming about, we've got to end capitalism because it's not serving me. And so one of the other premises that he comes up with is there were a few exceptions in the Arab Spring where the revolutions actually contributed to by people being able to talk to each other on the internet and organize, actually led to change. Because there was enough agreement that the change needs to be, we need to get rid of the dictator. And that was especially true in Egypt. And now what happened after that is there basically became a power vacuum. The revolutionaries weren't ready for what to happen next. And so the Muslim Brotherhood came in, and it's been a mess since. In Europe and in Israel, like you talked about, what he says in the book is there were these revolutions where people got together, they protested, they caused some real problems for a while, but they didn't have any plan for what to do next. And the word he uses to describe this idea of, we need to, posting on your Facebook feed before you hop in your Uber to go back to your house to have all the food you want to eat and the drinks you want to drink, is that we need to tear it all down, is this nihilistic approach to solving these problems. They don't have ideas of how we're going to get to the other side. A lot of the people that have been motivated by this tsunami of information.
Well, and so one of the things that I wrote down here 3 and 4 times, I bet you it's maybe 5 times, is another constant or consistent theme through this book is, and he said it repeatedly, is they're complaining. He said it with better words than that. They're complaining. They're raging against the machine, right? With no plan in place. There was one point in time he was reading, and I can't remember which insurgency it was, but a list of their demands. Tear this down, end this, end this, end this. But there was no then what? There's no then where are we pointing? What are we pointing to that we want to get to eventually? Because government is inevitable. We've talked about this. I think if you put groups of people together, they're eventually going to clumsily move towards some sort of leadership in government. And then there's going to be power. And then you're going to have this thing called government. And to watch him lay out one riot or one protest after the other, and all of them have the same thing in common, tear it down. Okay. And then what? That's why they kind of all eventually died off. Can I go backwards 1 second with you before we go forward?
Sure.
Okay. You brought up the JFK thing, and he gave 2 examples, one with JFK and one with Obama, how the media is a little different now in a certain way. So when JFK had the catastrophe of the Bay of Pigs, the media was his first real time having the negative side of media. But that answer that you gave, because there was the interview on camera, and then, there was the speech he gave, but then that little famous quote where you said it ends, as far as our extent, it ends with me.
To the extent the United States was involved, I was the responsible officer.
That was actually, according to what I was listening, I just listened to that part again today. That was actually a question he got from a reporter saying, hey, basically, we know the truth. We kind of know what we know how involved the United States was. What do you say to that? That was his response. And that wasn't really an answer to his question. And then after their little spark of we're disappointed, the media hands off. He talked about how loyal they were and how the United States as a people, we were still kind of like, you know what? We believe in our president, dadgummit, and we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. Fast forward to Obama, 2008, comes in, and I think within a month or two, he passes the big stimulus that promised a bunch of stuff. It failed miserably. it was a success for policy because he did what he said he was going to do. But over time, people saw it failed. And then the Democrats got demolished in the 2009, 2010 elections. And he was just kind of he was laying those side by side going, in that span of time, there is what we're talking about. Because we see failure, now the media is not loyal anymore. And even if the media is loyal, there's enough information out there, we can make decisions off of it now without the help from ABC.
And I think that's an important point you just made, that the media now might be loyal. If you round up everybody who was reporting on John Kennedy in 1962 or 61, whenever the Bay of Pigs were, it's sort of the same networks and media outlets that it is today. Maybe we have MSNBC now instead of the Philadelphia Inquirer being more important. But when he said that, the media basically said, well, we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's a young guy. Well, when Barack Obama did that kind of stuff, and then when any Democrats done anything recently, like Biden, the mainstream media kind of still does the same thing.
Yep.
Well, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. He's trying hard. He's a nice guy. He's better than Trump. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt. The problem today, the big difference is there were not 40 million blogs, and how many people use Facebook? It's a billion or something. Yeah.
Look at this. I'm a reporter now with a camera everywhere. I don't need a cameraman. I have my news station right here. I can create my own news right here. He gave a statistic in there for people who I've said this before, and they always get frustrated with me. Some people do. He talked about some studies. 90% of the coverage of President Trump, the first 2 years he was in office, was all negative. The media could not find positives. They couldn't find it. And the economy's getting better. All these things were getting better. They couldn't find it. And in 2017, the top story was collusion with Russia and Trump, which ended up being a complete farce, basically. And he talks about that. And it's almost 1984. The party asked you to not believe what you were seeing with your eyes, right? And they were like, hey, don't pay attention to what you really know. Just listen to our 90% of this. That didn't happen to JFK.
Right. But at the same time, that was everybody going against him, but it wasn't universal. So the 10% of the media that wasn't controlled by the elites that were surrounding the usual method, the usual story, the story got out anyway. There were still plenty of people that could find out what Trump had actually done, what laws what executive orders he had passed, and what kind of stuff he was doing. So if Trump did something well, there may have only been 10% of the media reporting it, but the half of America that supported Trump could go read those stories. And that's a big part of the difference. That's what's so important about this book, is to recognize that while 90% of the media may now be sort of aligned with each other, they still act like that means they have the total control of the information, that they are the old style, top down, I talk, you listen, media elites, and everybody's going to take it. What they're not taking into account is, well, certainly on TV, there's the opposite. There's Fox News, which does some of the same stuff the other way around.
Yep.
But if you want to go online, you go to Facebook. Some of your friends have found something where, the Epic Times or one of the other newspapers has reported the opposite, and you can go find it that way. You can go directly to those websites. You can read a different source of information. That 10% of, let's put it this way, 10% of today's media is probably more media by volume than the total media available in the 1960s.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I heard the author interviewed, and he basically, one of the questions he was asked is, aren't you concerned that some of the media censorship that's happening now, especially on Facebook and stuff like that, is going to it's going to change the dynamic and slow what's happening, because that's what's going on in China. In China, people don't have as much access to the information. And Martin Gary's response was, you think so? Really? You think people in China can't look up stuff? You don't think the people in China have figured out a way to go around the censorship that's put out by the government in China? He's pretty confident that the general public in China is pretty well informed, and they go to other ways to get it. And in America, we don't have the First Amendment protections when you're online, so there's some censorship. But by gosh, there's other ways to get around, and that's a whole nother discussion.
Let me ask you a quick question
about shutting stuff down. But we're going to here. Let me just point this out. Within the next few years, I think we're going to see a lot more platforms develop, and it's going to get even more diffuse.
Unless Amazon shuts you down and doesn't carry you until you come back on and change your terms of agreement and to match the thing. My question to you is, though, Facebook's an American company, technically speaking. Do you think they should be operating in other countries based off the First Amendment, or changing their rules of engagement based off the country they're in? Just your gut
That's
reaction.
a fascinating question. The First Amendment does not operate outside the United States. There are countries that technically have free speech according to their constitutions, although how they interpret it varies from country to country. I'm fine with Facebook being a private corporation and having some rules when they operate in different countries. My concern is that I think there's a legitimate case to be made that Facebook and Twitter and a couple other key companies have become the de facto public square.
Oh, they have, yeah.
That there's, and as a lawyer, I'll just break this down as quickly as I can and say it this way. There's some case law that basically says if a private corporation owns the property where everybody gathers, they can censor speech, like in a mall, or even in New York City, the PBS channel has actually licensed to a private company, and the Supreme Court said they could restrict content. But there's an old Supreme Court case that says when there was a company mining town and there was no public park that wasn't owned by the company couldn't say, oh, that area around the bandstand where people gather, because that's a private area, you can't have free speech and you can't meet there and gather and talk about forming a union or whatever. And the Supreme Court said, no, the First Amendment can apply to an entity that is so closely doing what the government does that it's effectively acting like the government. It owns the only space where you can talk. And I think there's good arguments that Facebook is closer to being the de facto public square. Now, the other argument is if they're not going to act like that and they're going to start censoring, then they're acting like a monopoly, and they're so big when there's only
collusion amongst them.
Yeah, and there's only, well, first of all, there's one of them might be so big, but then when you add in the collusion, we've got some other legal arguments. Now, this goes beyond what the Revolt of the Public covers, because frankly, he wrote his book in 2014, and then a lot of he was predicting came true. He wrote the supplemental chapters in 2017, I think maybe got published in 2018. I can't wait to read what he's going to write next. That's going to describe what happened in 2020 with the coronavirus and the all the other protests and everything. What he predicted seems to be coming true. To me, it's fascinating, and it really applies to what we're trying to figure out. What just happened this last year?
Well, and real quick to wrap up that conversation about social media, when you have the government saying, if you do this or if you don't do that, we are going to penalize you, and then they go out and do this and don't do that, I think it almost is a puppeteer saying, hey, move your mouth when I need you to move your mouth, and don't move your mouth. So like you said, they end up becoming a de facto branch of the government or arm of the government.
And is that a campaign violation?
Oh, God. Anyway.
Right? So if I can't give more than $2,000 to my local state senator or whatever the limit is, so what if I just say, okay, then I'm going to spend, Clinton, you know more than I do. What if I buy a billboard that's one of those flashy ones and I wanted to have that state senator's name on it? If I spend $5,000 for a month, that'll give me a fair amount of billboard time, won't it?
Yeah.
Well, that's 2.5 times the donation, right? So I can't spend that much. So, but could I go put up a billboard?
Well, that's why you have PACs.
Well, but that's kind of the rule we're getting into is if Facebook goes out there and says, vote for Ilhan Omar, she's fantastic, or takes down her opponent and deplatforms her opponent, which Twitter did, by the way, then that's assisting in a campaign. I would call that election interference, actually, by the standards we've just learned in the last couple of years.
Well, they just don't run the Hunter Biden story till 3 months later, and they go, oh, by the way, that's a real story, by the way. Hey, we forgot to post that. You know, one of the things.
Wait a minute, wrap that up. So what do we know after all that, Clint?
Well, I was going to say
that's one more reason that the public doesn't trust the media.
Oh, yeah, agree.
Right? Because that's not a secret story. That wasn't withheld from us. What was withheld to most people, but a lot of people knew what was going on at the time, and then even more people found out later on it was in fact going on. So what's there left to trust is one of the great questions about this.
You know, you made this point earlier. I watched a little short 10-minute video with him. I'll put the link up here in just a little bit. But he had a little supplemental thing where he talked about 2019. There were 25 insurgencies around the world. And the weird thing for him was when he said is it was not based off, it wasn't, the insurgencies weren't led by people from poor economics or that were not in democracies. It was in countries that had the democracies and, like you said, more middle of the road, middle class. And he said, what happens? There's these fractured groups of people. That's what the public is. And then they come together and they actually, he said a great line, and I'm going to screw it up, but basically he said, they view destruction as part of progress or a form of progress. And I was like, man, that sums up what we've watched all summer last year. The whatever our cause is greater. And that's the other thing I took away before we moved to the last third of this conversation was the media and even we the people forfeited the principles of journalism, the principles of how we're supposed to treat fellow citizens. We forfeited that because we thought getting rid of Trump or getting rid of Biden or getting rid of Hillary Clinton, however we justified it, we sacrificed that on the altar of our principles. We abandoned stuff because we felt that it was worth it. And so when you do that, when you get on the other side of your cause and you have no principles that really support you, what do you do then? Where do you go at that point? Does that make sense?
It does. And let's try to restate it this way. If you're
real quick, side speak, that means Eric's going to say it smarter than I just did.
If you give up your objectivity in order to pursue a cause, don't expect people to recognize you as being objective again afterwards.
Absolutely. Well, and so let me apply it to something else, and then it might be a good segue. As experts, because he talked a lot about how experts have been hijacked. As an expert, when you have given up the scientific process, when you have given up your objectivity and you've given up understanding in your role in this big picture,
or a commitment to telling the truth.
That's it. Don't expect people to trust you, except my technocrats and experts I'll put against yours. You know, he gave a great, and you'll remember this so much better than me, gave a great example about scientists and health experts. But except he used the climate change. He used the climate emergency, where they quit participating in peer reviews because they were starting to get questioned by people they didn't feel worthy of questioning them. So they just shut them off. And they actually were saying some super egotistical things like, who are they to question us? When in reality, questioning the scientific process is part of the process. And it was amazing.
It's a great part of the book. It's a great story, and what you said is basically true, and it's really important for people to read to get the details. But the essence of it, like you said, was the information to support certain theories about climate change was publicly available because they were peer reviewing each other's papers. The problem was there were only 3 or 4 little groups of scientists that would peer review each other's papers. And so
and pat each other on the back,
mostly agree. And if you dissented, you weren't invited to be one of those 3 or 4 little groups. So somebody without even a degree in that area of science, a guy from Canada, asked for the information that he was entitled to get as part of the peer review process because it has to be public. And they started stonewalling him. And he started getting some of the information a little bit at a time, but then they kept stonewalling him. And eventually it came out. The emails that these people who were supposed to be double checking each other and peer reviewing each other were basically all on the same team, and we need to circle the wagons and not let anybody know. They're not entitled to question us. Well, when that stuff comes out, it should be a real eye-opener that we have a problem with the so-called scientific experts, also sometimes known as technocrats, who not only do they have maybe have an agenda, but they're going to bend over backwards to hide the agenda to keep it alive so they can have their power and their authority.
That's it right there, though. Eric better not question us, because if he does, they may prove if I have been solicited by a certain party, Republican or Democrat, or this organization or that organization, and they need me to end up in a certain location, and I craft the scientific process in such a way as to reflect what they need. And then all of a sudden, other people start questioning that, going, "Hey, wait a minute! I don't think you're doing that right, or the outcomes don't make sense to me. Can we talk that through?" In the back of your brain, at that point, if the curtain is pulled back, I'm going to lose good standing. I'm going to lose my authority. What does that mean? I'm not going to be a technocrat. I'm not going to be part of the group anymore. And that is that clinging to wanting to have the power. To me, when he started bringing up that climate change part, really resonated, because I see that now. Like when you get your red card and you see red cars everywhere, I see technocrats and experts clinging to their power all around me now. And it pisses me off.
Well, but that's what's so good about this book, right, Clint?
No.
After at least has opened up your eye. Yeah. Then the question is, right? Would you rather go through life with your head buried in the sand and not worrying about the hyena that's about to bite you in the rear end? Or would you rather be the ostrich with his head up and maybe you have a chance to see the hyena coming and can run away?
Yeah, we all get eaten.
Eventually, right? Well, that's kind of the point, is what can we do about this? And I think this is a good time to segue into
have we met your first two? Because I loved your outline. Did we set it up correctly? And have we talked about how it's undermined authority enough to you?
I think so, although we can always talk about more, because there's so many examples that he gives, and then there's other examples we can think of that are going on today. Let me do that, Clint. Let's bring it around to current events. So in the last day or two, we've been told now for a while that you have to wear a mask after you've been vaccinated, and people are scratching their head and go, "Why that? If the vaccine's so good, why would you still have to wear a mask?" And then, if the vaccine's really effective, then why are we still telling people that they have to go through all this stuff after they've been vaccinated? And one of the things you and I have noticed is, if you try to talk about those things, but you're a right-wing source or a source that previously supported Trump, people ignore you, they shut you down, you're not allowed to have those kind of opinions. Well, when the public is starting to question the advice from the CDC and authorities so much that it's coming from the New York Times and Vox, we're starting to see some breakthrough levels of distrust of the government and question the government. So it was the New York Times that just broke the story. So let's set it up this way. The essential reason why they're telling people who have been vaccinated that they still need to wear a mask, or that you even have to wear a mask outside at all if you haven't been vaccinated, the CDC reported that, quote, less than 10% of the transmission of coronavirus has happened between two people outside. That's why you should wear masks, because it's almost 10%. But if you actually go in and evaluate the study, and this is the New York Times, which has now become a fairly liberal side of the news media,
quite a bit.
That they actually went back and they finally did the hard work of analyzing what's the data based on, where do the numbers come from, and they found some major flaws because they overemphasized this data that came from Singapore for some reason. For some reason, there was this huge transmission rate outdoors in Singapore, and they went back and looked at that data, and it turned out it was all false, because in Singapore they were counting all of these indoor jobs and indoor locations as potentially outdoor, so they got reported as outdoor transmission. Bottom line, the actual rate of outdoor transmission that we've been able to scientifically determine is less than 0.1% of all the transmissions. So one case in 1,000 instead of one case in 10. But the CDC was reporting it as one case in 10. That's why everybody needs to wear a mask outside. So high school girls running track and collapsing on the finish line because they've been wearing a damn mask. Or we just saw a picture the other day of rugby in Chicago where guys are tackling each other and wearing a mask, because somehow it's about 10% of the infections. No, the infection rate was never 10% outside. It's 0.1 or less. And they're doing more research and finding out it's even less. And here's the thing. It doesn't become accepted by a lot of people until it comes out in the New York Times. But now the New York Times is reporting it. And then very similarly, without as much detail, Vox magazine, which is also something not on the right, has come out and basically issued a good article that basically says vaccinated health professionals have zero concern about the virus, and we shouldn't either. Once you've been vaccinated, it's time to take off your mask and stop worrying about it.
I talked to a doctor the other day. I will not give his name. And I was doing the fist bump. I'm the guy that stays a little more cautious. But I was saying, hey, we're going to do this. He was helping me with something with an event. We don't have masks. He goes, dude, I haven't worn a mask in 3 months. I've been vaccinated. We're good. But here's the other thing. But then
it only takes one of the two people to have been vaccinated, right? We act like We act like the vaccine's not effective until I've heard this from several people. I wish the rest of the people get vaccinated like I have been so we can go back to normal. And the answer, well, why are you worried about it? If you've been vaccinated,
Well, if you do transmit it, it's very low and the dose is low. But
there's zero
yeah,
evidence of somebody
that's
vaccinated
it.
having
There's no
transmitted.
studies. Well, here's the other thing I wrote down is one more example. I can't remember the name of the reporter, but he was asking a Biden administrator, or it may be a spokesman, or maybe the health guy. I can't remember because I watched this last week. But he asked him, why is President Biden wearing a mask outside all the time? Especially when he's if he's in a room full of other people and all those people have been vaccinated. So everyone,
all those elite technocrat managerial class people.
Listen, this is a good question. I was proud of this reporter. They asked, why is the president wearing a mask in a room full? Let me promise you, if there's people vaccinated on planet Earth, anyone in the room with President Biden has been vaccinated. They know. So if he's in a room full of vaccinated people, why is he wearing a mask, and why is he wearing a mask outside when he's at a podium, or as he walks up to the podium, he takes it off? He's not around anybody. Well, the guy answered in this rambling 15 or 20-second answer. He's trying to good example. And then at the end of it, he says, and just so you know, the president will always follow the CDC guidelines. That's not the CDC guidelines. Now, I wish the reporter would have said that, but they moved on, and I understood because of time, but that's not the CDC guidelines. And so you look at this,
and the point of these two articles was the CDC guidelines have been too restrictive, and now we know that. But now what's interesting to me is, it's Vox and the New York Times finally starting to question the narrative. So
here's what's bad. If I had posted that 2 months ago, I would have had friends call me conspiracy theorist, or I'm trying to kill grandmothers.
No, you wouldn't.
I'm trying to.
Facebook would have taken it down.
That's what I was going to say. Or Facebook would have taken it down. All of a sudden, the accepted the check mark people say it, and it's okay. And that's the other thing. I'm not sure. You'll know history better than I did, and I think we actually talked about this on a previous conversation. Something happened in the 1900s, early 1900s, late 1800s. There was a point in time where you didn't have to be a judge to be appointed to the Supreme Court, and it's somewhere along the lines, we started pointing, and I think he gives Albert Einstein as one of the first technocrats, but we started elevating people to this. They're just way smarter than me. They may know more than you about something. It does not mean they're smarter than you.
So this is a great segue to part 3 of our conversation.
You're welcome.
Which is that. Thank you, Clint, and you're handsome.
Yes, sir.
What do we do about this, and what can the Americans do? What can our society do? And one is to think about finding the leaders who are not going to get caught out in a lie, finding leaders that are trustworthy, finding leaders that are courageous, and finding leaders that are humble, that they're not going to engage in a bunch of hubris, that they don't think they can solve all the problems. Now, the specific example you gave is an important one. Earl Warren was the governor of California. Earl Warren was a fantastic politician who was kind of a common sense kind of guy who could see where the political winds are blowing, but also really look at what's the best thing you can do to solve a problem. What are the simple solutions to a problem? He was appointed to the Supreme Court, and what the Warren Court did to modernize America and move us forward, a lot of the rights we take for granted today came under the Warren Court, including Brown versus Board of Education, including the Miranda rights you have when you were arrested, including the Gideon rights that you have to have an attorney present in your trial if you've been accused of the crime that can result in jail time, including the Brady Supreme Court case that says that the prosecutor has evidence against you and evidence for you. He has to turn both of them over. If he has evidence that would help exonerate you, he has to turn them over. All of those are just small examples of what the Brady Court did to modernize America.
You mean the Warren Court?
I'm sorry, the Warden Court, to modernize us, to get us moved forward. And because Warren didn't say, now, wait a minute. Technically, under the rule of stare decisis, that means we always have to go with what previous judges say, unless there's a change in the law or the Constitution. So we're going to go with what they've always said, and what The United States has always said, for example, is separate but equal, and separate but equal means that black people can be on a different train car that's not as nice as the one that the white people are on, and or they can go to separate schools. And he said, no, that's not what America needs. We're not doing that anymore. We're not going to follow the technocrat answer of being a lawyer. We're going to do what the Supreme Court should do and fix a very bad wrong and say it's unconstitutional for kids to be in separate schools. Separate but equal is not okay. And the same thing with, for example, the Gideon law, the Gideon rule, which is that if you are at a trial and you're accused of a crime that could result in jail time, the government better provide you an attorney. You have a right to counsel, even if you can't pay for it. That wasn't a rule, and that wasn't established by the Constitution. So Earl Warren came up with help the court go in the right direction. And what do we have today? We've got some really weird Supreme Court rulings that are hyper technical. And I would say Justice Scalia, I'm kind of a fan of, but he's the worst. He reads arcane stuff into the law and comes up with rulings that don't make sense unless you're just reading them from a hyper technocrat technical ruling of how do you read that law?
Well, and the reason I brought that up is, as we segue into this last part on what's next, is one of the things that I wrote this down a bunch on this last page as we started as we go into this last segment. I have said this a bunch. It all is going to end up coming back to on how we handle it as the people. It is weak. I do not think we had this conversation earlier today about Trump. Was he the right guy for the job at the time? I think he was. I would, if Nikki Haley ran now, or Dan Crenshaw, or Ron DeSantis, or Tim Scott, whatever, whoever, I would vote for people other than
Joe Manchin.
I would vote for other people than Trump. But I think he was the guy at the time because we needed somebody abrasive to match the other side that was trying to build the wall, not just a curtain between us and them. They were trying to make it impregnable, and I think they're still trying that. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to how we handle it. He said in the book that we can control it by our votes, by the books we read, the conversations we have, the circle of friends we put around us. Man, all of his suggestions, this is where you told me not to save my bad guy comments till the end. All of his suggestions on how to fix this come down to if we decide to start acting like Americans again. Every bit of it. And that's so simple. I just don't know if we're not fractured beyond the point of there's a large group of people that have spent the last 4 years calling the other people names. I don't know. And I do think there's bad guys and girls out there that you know, the line, the wolves among the sheep. And I think they're out there and they see these critical points in the United States. They see the cycles. They may not know that they're in the cycles, but they see these joints that are happening, these transitional periods. They see that they can take advantage. They can hide their propaganda amongst real and fake news. And I think they're trying to turn the ship. I think they're trying to get the levers of power. And I'm a little cynical about how he put it towards the end. Now, what is that? Does that strike a chord with you at all? Or are you the opposite?
I think it gives me hope. I'm not quite as cynical. I do think it's a lot of hard work. Let's hit on a couple of the points of advice that he gives.
Yeah.
So one is we do need to be looking for better leaders, that Americans need to insist on better leaders. I don't know what we were supposed to do with Trump versus Biden or Trump versus Clinton. We were offered two stark choices. But the interesting thing is that the apparent authority of the political parties is one of the things he describes as significantly going downhill. If the Republicans had had their way, Jeb Bush would have been the nominee in 2016. Well, he couldn't round up 3% of the vote, and people weren't interested in him. And so it was one of the symptoms of this tsunami of information that they were looking for somebody different. And one of the other points you made is, well, it took Trump. I would say it took somebody like Trump. If Trump would not have been able to do what he did in 1980 or 1990 or even 2000. Ross Perot didn't succeed in 1980, but he did mess up an election a little bit. I'm sorry, 92. He messed up an election a little bit. So what does he suggest in his book? Well, number one, leaders are going to survive better in this age of information and misinformation if they work on being, first of all, honest, because then they're not going to be called out on the lies, humble, don't show a lot of hubris, and courageous, willing to stand up and do the right thing and recognize why they're being called to serve as a politician and not just for their own personal power. An example of how they might do that. Remember, we talked earlier about how the failure of the big democracies in the 20th century that people are starting to rally against and rail against is they promised they would fix the war on poverty. Didn't end poverty. The war on drugs didn't end the drug problem. The civil rights movement didn't end all race problems.
And nothing ever will end any of that. But go ahead.
Well, we can make some progress. We can fix stuff around the edges, but we can't fix it 100%. We're not going to be able to create a utopia. And so one of the other things he suggests is politicians need to go back to the era of what can government actually do effectively and make those promises and live up to those promises. And we've talked about this a couple times before because I think it's just a great quote. Governor Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan has done some really questionable stuff since she's been in office. And so let's ignore what she's done in office. That's not the point. The point is, what did she run on that appealed to the public in Michigan? And the answer is she ran on a platform of just fix the damn roads. That's what government can do well. So those are two suggestions he had: finding people that are humble, honest, and courageous to be good leaders. And as a politician, anybody who wants to be a leader, make promises you can keep, like just fixing the damn roads.
Okay, so I don't know how comfortable you want to get. This is why I love live stuff. Am I allowed to give pushback and be the poo-pooer on some of this, or do you want me to move on and just say I agree?
Why are you asking my permission? Poo-poo away.
Okay, so let me get through this before you jump in, unless it's just something so critical that you feel like I'm going to take us off the rails. First of all, I love the idea of just fix the damn roads. The problem with that is Clint runs on just fix the damn roads. And people go, yes. My competition over here runs on I'm going to make sure that everybody's equal and gets equal pay, and I'm going to end racism. It's going to be there's the moral platforms that people run on now, because everything is something. Everything is racism. Everything is trans. Everything is something bigger than just the policy that it affects. So if Clint goes down and just is going to run on policies, I'll have a big, strong group of people that support me. But I'm not going to have the moral soapbox to stand on and go, I want us to be better and I want us to look at people based off the content of their character, not the color of their skin. I don't know if government can do that. Okay. The second thing is, when you say we need better leaders, I agree. But my question back to you, and it's rhetorical, so don't jump in and answer it quite yet, but is, do you think better leaders could survive the scrutiny or would run? In other words, if Mitt Romney ran, and he is a lukewarm Republican at best by today's standards, but when he ran, they painted that guy as evil. When McCain ran, they loved him now, and unfortunately he passed away, and I think he's, whatever. But when he ran, the media tore him a new one. Good people are not portrayed as good people to the mass media now because they've picked a side. So when you're redefining what racism is, when you start redefining the word sexual preference online and within a 24-hour period, if I can redefine the words, then I can look back into Eric, who is a good leader, and I can look into your past and you say, be honest. But 8 years ago, Eric, when you didn't know you were going to run, you did this. That's racist. Or you did this, and why don't you like poor people? And you did this, and you're misogynistic. In other words, they are so vested in reframing who Eric Buchanan, the possible good leader, is as not perfect, that we would have. I don't think the days of George Washington could exist right now because he was so flawed by today's standards. Eric Buchanan's going to be the same way. So I don't know if anybody other than people like, oh, this makes my heart hurt, the Donald Trumps, the Rocks, the Oprah Winfreys, the people who have the celebrity power to just mesmerize us with their name. I don't know if good leaders could make it through the process.
Which of those 5 questions do you want me to
go with the promises first? Go with the promises. Yeah, so how do I win that one?
Yeah. So part of what you're seeing is the old promises are still working some, but they're starting to peter out. When Joe Biden sat up there and talked about promising equity and attacking Trump as being a racist, Arguably that Biden got a lot of votes from the Black Lives Matter crowd. If you've been paying any attention, the Black Lives Matter folks are pissed as hell about how they've been left out of any conversations, and they are not Biden fans. And some of those man on the street interviews of the African American community that supported Biden, they're already mad. And are we even into 100 days yet?
We slightly passed 100 days.
Just slightly past 100 days, and he is, he's overpromised and underdelivered, and that's the pattern that is the late 20th century.
But do you think me promising to pave the damn roads would win those people over?
Worked in Michigan for Gretchen Whitmer in a purple state.
There you go.
I think it's going to work.
And when I said those people, I mean Democrats. So don't everybody get your panties in a wad for the love of all that's holy.
So I think part of what's interesting is you maybe still going to have to make big promises to win in California and New York, although we'll see. What's going on with the mayor's race in New York City is going to be interesting. But I think if you're in a state that's competitive, making honest promises, I think is going to be something that's going to be a better chance to win, especially if you can keep those promises and then you keep getting better and better. Another part of your question is, well, how's the message going to get through? Well, that's the whole point of this book, The Revolt of the Public, is that, yeah, the mainstream media is going to call you names and lie about it or misconstrue what you say, but the mainstream media doesn't control the flow of information anymore. It's no longer a monopoly. And so there's other ways that information is getting out. So people can still be competitive, even if they're swimming upstream against the mainstream media. That's gonna play out. So it might make it harder, but I think that's going to change in the next few years as more platforms and more other ways to talk about stuff is going to come out. You talked about what about choosing? Are people going to be willing to run and survive this game? Well, that applies to both sides, and both sides better find the courage. And what I say by applies to both sides, Bill Clinton had a great quote years ago that the way that people are attacked for their personal behavior, it's called the politics of personal destruction. Now, the fact that he pointed it out is a good point that it should have, we shouldn't go attacking people necessarily for every personal bad behavior. Now, if you do something in the White House in the interim, maybe that does raise it to a different standard.
Yeah.
But we let John Kennedy get away with it, and he was a good leader. He's, my great grandmother had pictures of him all over her house, all that kind of stuff. So can we develop the attitude that don't care so much about some of your personal stuff as long as it doesn't affect your real issues, which is, are you honest, are you courageous, and are you humble? And I think those attributes are going to go a long way. And part of it is the American people have got to start insisting on that.
That's it.
So it's going to take it's going to take some education. People have got to read this book or have these same conversations we're having, or learn through other experiences. That don't elect the guy who's making you the utopian promises. Elect the guy who says he can fix the problems that government can fix.
Dude, let me ask you a question.
I mean, any politician, man, woman, or whatever they are.
Let me ask you a question.
Or Caitlyn Jenner.
Okay, good luck with that one. And you, sir, are a jerk for bringing that up towards the end of this conversation. I'll hold that against you until we can talk about it at a different time. But you said, humble, ego in check. And one of the last principle he brought up that it's going to take is courage. And you said it's going to take reading books like this. Man, to be honest with you, we now are so backwards in society. We call things courage to say things that are going to get your political points on social media. And we say, oh, look how courageous they are for standing up for whatever. When in reality, it's more courageous to stand up for the American principles that the very system that the people out there are griping about and wanting to tear down is the very system that's giving them the opportunity to express their opinions and to hope and that gives their voice, that turns the volume up on their voice. The very system that they're complaining about is the one that has allowed us to clumsily and with all kinds of screw ups and ugliness and messiness and sin involved, but it's allowed us to navigate this horrible thing called racism and misogyny more and better and faster than almost any other society in history, along with adding value to the rest of the world with inventions and things. So when I hear that, I immediately go to, what book am I going to read about courage? Courage is something that is instilled in us, either from parents or from teachers or from people above us that have come before us. And when we are raising kids that I think are being indoctrinated to not even like the country they're living in, I get frustrated because I agree with everything you said and what he said in this book, but you're not going to read a book to understand. You can read about courage, but you don't see it in real life around you, especially when all the terms and definitions have been flipped upside down. And what's courage is not courage, it's narcissism and nihilism. I'm done. Pass the plate.
Do you feel better now?
No, dadgummit. I'm still mad.
No,
But
this book doesn't answer all those questions because he doesn't assume, one, that there's especially bad actors out there that are the individuals causing the biggest problems, and well, several reasons, and two, he's pretty nonpartisan. So he talks about how Obama and Trump both appealed to nihilism and both appealed to the destruction of the systems without necessarily finding a replacement. And both of them were able to play the game of being the outsider and say, well, it's not my fault, it's the system's fault, and the system is corrupt and old and failed, and we need to change it. And then at the end of the day, yeah, you can say they're trying to tell people there's a different word for courageous. Well, we can fight back by trying to make sure that people remain educated and have an opportunity to learn. And at this point, I think here, let me just say, I hope that we've hit somewhat of a high watermark of this Wokistan, anti-American, you can't even discuss differences of opinion, and we're going to try to teach people different stuff. There's still going to be waves of it we're going to have to deal with. But what's happened in the last year is people who care about this stuff have become aware of the problem. They've woken to the problem, and we're ready, and people are paying attention and are going to question some of these narratives that are coming through that I didn't realize what they were teaching in high school until this year. I didn't realize what kind of stuff they were teaching in colleges that much and how widespread it is. But I also still think it's a pretty small segment of society. And at the end of the day, you can teach your son and your daughter what the word courage means. Yes. They're not learning that from the description of Caitlyn Jenner, who was described as courageous because he changed into a she and then went public about it.
Well, and I'm not discounting.
Even that could be described as courageous.
Yeah, I'm not discounting it. I'm just saying it can't just be courage when it meets the Wokistan definition, but it's not courageous to say that I believe in America with all its flaws. That to me has got to be a basic minimums, that we love our country just like we love other things like our family, our religion, and our football teams.
And I think it's also counts as courageous when people like you and me, who tend to be more conservative or libertarian, are willing to stand up and say what Trump did on January 6th was bad. I don't think he actually said words that are as insightful as some of the stuff that Democrat politicians have said, but carrying on that election fight the way that he did and encouraging people to believe that the electoral college vote was actually some kind of a substantive fight that could be influenced by protest, and setting up that whole circumstance, which has been a big stain on his legacy. We would argue about whether there's other stains, but that's a darn big one. And I think it takes some courage for people who, I'd supported Trump a lot more than I supported Hillary Clinton or Biden, but damn it.
Look, dude, if you told me to vote for Biden or Trump again, I'm voting for Trump every time. If you tell me to vote for Hillary Clinton again or Trump, I'm voting for Trump every time. And that's with me knowing what I know and all of his rhetoric and crap. I would be more vocal about when he said things that are stupid because I think it matters. But that doesn't mean that Hillary was still not a worse choice, in my opinion. And it still doesn't mean, and let me tell you something, now that I've seen what Biden's doing, I would definitely, that it hardens me up to believe that. And that's sad because I think we can do better than Trump. That's why I'm saying I would vote for somebody like Nikki Haley or one of these other options, the Candace Owens. I hope she gets involved. And I think the Republicans and the moderate Democrats and the moderate Republicans are going to end up having this third party. We talked about it unofficially soon. But I want to say one last thing, and then I'm going to give you the floor about the book. You nailed it. Because there's the only magic pill in my mind for this. The only magic response, the answer, is going to come from the hard work of American people to be willing to engage in being wrong and right and listening and talking and the dialogue. That to me is the only solution that actually is possible, and it's very difficult.
More than Go back 20 years ago, and you and I could have never had this conversation that was viewed by other people. You and I could be sitting in the bar after a rugby match having this conversation, or we could go out to dinner together and have this conversation. We now live in an age where there is, once again, I'll say it, a tsunami of information, and that information can include the hard work from people that want to talk about this stuff, explore this stuff, figure out ways for us to come together, figure out ways for us to use better positive messaging, find leaders that are humble, honest, and courageous. In the right circumstances, find leaders, whether they're Christians that are willing to say, I believe in what Christ told his disciples at the Last Supper. His last commandment was love one another. Or it might be just somebody who says, I'm promising if you elect me, I will make sure that the kids learn how to read, or that we're going to fix the damn roads.
Yeah. And I would, there's 2 podcasts I would love to have with you at some point in time. And I've actually asked a couple other people to join me on these, and I don't think I'll get one. And you may know, I think you said, you know, somebody. I want to do a podcast over the last 60 to 70 years of education, because I am convinced education in ours, I'll be honest, if I were putting kids into public school, I wouldn't send them to public. I didn't send my kids to public school the last 2. If you go back 20 years, if
your
it was
last 2 kids, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, I had a stepson too, and he went to public school.
Yeah.
So my 2 kids that they've gone to a private school, I wouldn't send my kids to public school if I had a choice. I want to do one on on education, and I want to do one on. Oh, I had the other. It may have been religion. I can't remember what, but I want to do some podcasts on that's affected people, because especially the education, man, it is a big, big deal. And the last thing I wrote down that I wanted you to tell people about is why you like to have these big picture conversations and not just address headlines. I think that's interesting.
So I think we're having a different conversation than a lot of people are having online right now and on the internet and on social media. And I think the reason why this is so important is we can go back and forth and talk about whatever stupid thing Fauci has said today about masks, or the vaccine, or whatever stupid thing Trump said about injecting Clorox or not injecting Clorox, and whatever the crazy headline it is from you name it. But there's nothing those conversations are essentially going nowhere, because people are become tribal, made up their own minds. And I think the way that America is going to get through this crisis and move on to the next great phase in America is to start restoring civility, having the conversations where we can disagree, and finding the areas of agreement, or at least understanding that if we're going to have a policy debate, it's about the good ideas or bad ideas of that policy, and not whether your candidate said something mean or your candidate said something racist, or whatever it is that we're fighting over that's distracting from those things that can bring us back together as Americans. We've got to have these big picture conversations. Otherwise, we're just in a constant cycle of nanny back and forth boo-boos, and we're going to be in a giant whirlpool. We're going to get flushed down.
Have you thought of writing your own blog on a weekly or monthly basis, or writing your own book?
I've thought a little bit about it. I did write some stuff for our friend's website. I don't want to say where it was right now.
You're ashamed of it. I can't.
No, I'm not ashamed of it. I'm trying to be a little more nonpartisan when we're having these conversations.
I understand.
Although I'll admittedly say I lean conservative and libertarian.
But wait a minute. That's okay. I want to say this because it's important for people. If you'd have said that now, I agree with you. But if you were to say that if believing what you believe, go back 20 or 30 years, you'd be considered a liberal. I bet you.
Oh, let's have that conversation next time.
On some of your beliefs.
Because this goes. That's part of being a libertarian too. They do overlap with being a liberal. There are some of those things that are the traditional liberal beliefs.
Can y'all call your party something else so we can just all the ones on the right and the left can just join it?
Yeah, that was called the Tea Party.
No, they're racist. Tea Parties are racist.
That's bullshit. And I'm going to say that right out. That's exactly what we're talking about.
I agree. I'm just saying.
The Tea Party came out and had a very similar message, and the left was so afraid of it that they promptly jumped out there and had to call them racist. And that was before we as a general public realized that if the left can't argue with something, they're going to call them racist. And now I've really come out and shown my partisan beliefs at the end of this show. But
no, you haven't.
You got to have. I think the great big picture questions. Tell me how you disagree on those.
No.
If you're a liberal or progressive, Let's talk about it.
No,
And
look,
by the
man.
way, I got to put my heating pad after an hour because I have COVID shoulder.
Oh, man, I'm sorry, dude.
And COVID shoulder is a frozen shoulder. I had another buddy get this from spending so much time online with your hand on your mouse and doing other stuff. And then what little exercise I get, I have a frozen shoulder that's been stretched out some, but it's.
Well, I was going to say this. You're not showing you're a partisan because you just criticize Trump sometimes. That's the other thing. Criticizing your own, whatever side you lean to, doesn't mean you're a Republican, but criticizing those you agree with is vital in the political world we live in. And I think it's what we're missing is being able to criticize the people that we actually support. That's what adds legitimacy to what we're doing, I think, is that we're not saying this is all right, that's all wrong. We're saying it's kind of all the same. We're just trying to pick out the parts we like. The other thing I want to say, though, is I do believe I'm okay, you're okay philosophy kind of sucks because that means if I believe what you believe and no harm, no foul, I do think, though, as Americans, we have to say there are some things that are better to believe than other things. There are some things that are more pure to believe than other things. Being able to say that everybody should say and believe everything is a great way to get to chaos. As a society, we have to come together and say, you can have all thoughts, you can have all ideas, but some ideas are better, some thoughts are better, and some words are better. And I want to be the one to set that up for everybody.
Yeah, the Clint definition of the Overton circle.
Yeah,
So
why not?
for those of you who don't know what an Overton circle is, if you're looking at a set, one way that can be described as the ideas that are generally acceptable are the Overton circle ideas. So the idea that, what would be a great example, that we should round up everybody and have them not only vaccinated, but have them sterilized so they can't have kids is probably a radical idea outside of the Overton circle of acceptable behavior. To restoring some kind of a racist slavery system, that would be outside the Overton circle. That we should round up all white people and burn them to punish them for the historic racism that happened 150 years ago.
Dude, you're going really extreme outside the Overton circle.
Those are the easy ones, right?
Yeah.
So what is the Overton circle? Is it within the Overton circle to debate X versus Y? And the answer I think we've got to get back to in America is if you're having a conversation that there is a significant number of people agree X might be true, the other side is not allowed to say, you can't say that because blank.
Let's sit down.
So we have to be careful about how we establish those Overton circles. Otherwise, we can't have discussions about the ideas in these great books that people need to learn from.
Well, and that's why I think when politicians promise unity, we don't get it because they propose things that we've not discussed as a nation. They've just discussed as the party in charge, and they implement them on other people and not with other people. So with all that being said, the revolt of the public, Martin Gurri.
Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennia. I think it's mandatory reading for anybody who wants to try to figure out what's going on today in our society. It's part of the reason we're so polarized, and it's part of the reason that there's people like Trump that can get elected, and part of the reason that we just don't trust our institutions anymore.
Look, I want to get a former teacher because I don't think a current teacher would do it right now. I want to do a next special with you. Either you pick out the next book, or let's do a special on education and get 2 or 3 people to pop in and off with us. I want to talk about where education, where it came from, how it's changed and morphed. And that I'm telling everybody now, it's an hour-and-a-half podcast, but it's going to have 2 or 3 other guests. And now that's my goal. And I want to do it 2 to 3 weeks from tonight. I want to do it quick.
Do our best.
I'm going to do it, man. I'm a doer, buddy. I'm a doer. Eric Buchanan, I hope your shoulder feels better, man. Thanks for coming on with me, buddy.
Yeah, it was great. Good job, Clint. Very, very good job. That was fun.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you later.
All right. See you.
Bye.
Bye.